So we're delighted to be joined now by Fabian Chessell, the founder or one of the founders of the Data Alliance. Fabian, this is a new alliance that you're putting together. You've got together a bunch of government digital people or data people from across various government departments, and you're saying the government needs to do data better. So could you start by just telling us what's the big problem here that you're trying to solve?
The big problem is right across government, you cannot share data. Well, you can, but it is so tough, so difficult that most efforts are long delayed, long grass, the team moves on and nothing really happens. And it's one of the sources of sludge within our public sector that just make everything from policing to healthcare to the benefits to your education systems work less good than it should.
And was there a particular moment or is there a particular example you think that really exemplifies this sort of problem?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's a funny one because it's something that if you are employed and you don't rely on government services, you're not going to encounter it that often. Like coming
Hmm.
from Australia to the UK, I found suddenly my tax return didn't pre-populate in the way that it did in Australia. And certainly if you've been to the NHS, you'll have had the experience of having to repeat your allergies, your medications, your details again and again. And apart from that, how much do you really notice it? But the moment you start relying on government services, that's when it can really impact you. It's part of the reason it's super unfair because it'll impact the people who are worst off in our society. A fantastic example is one of my co-founders. Maura has a son who is congenitally deaf with profound hearing loss. And every 2 years, she has to reapply to DWP for the support, even though, funnily enough, he's still congenitally deaf 2 years later. And even though the system knows that he's congenitally deaf because he's getting support from the NHS. But it can get worse than that. Like I found out the other day that the police are spending, I think, 770,000 hours a year redacting information from the CPS. And I sit there and I think, the CPS and the police aren't that different and shouldn't they be working as one team? And yet we're spending that amount of time, something like 600 police officers, half of Warwickshire Police Force is just spending their time redacting data from another bit of the criminal justice system. What a waste. What a waste.
So it's all about the frictions between all these different bits of government. I guess, like if you've got a DWP who want to talk to another bit of DWP, they can probably reach into the database and get your stuff. But then if they need to pass the data to another government agency, that's where you hit all of these. Is it the bureaucratic or technical hurdles or legal hurdles? What are the sort of frictions there?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, on that, actually, I think there's a really kind of data sharing laws, were invented in the world and it sort of had a reasonable assumption that when you share data is when it moves across organizations' barriers. And it kind of sounds right. Like, you do probably want, if Facebook's going to talk to Google, you probably want some controls over that. What they didn't really factor in was in the public sector that we've actually split every single hospital hospital trust from every other hospital trust. We have, I think, 220, 230 hospital trusts as separate organizations that therefore have to go for the full data sharing malarkey to share information between them. Same with the 43 police forces, same with the 330 odd councils. And if you then bear in mind that if you're trying to join the dots in York or London, you've got multiple GPs, multiple hospital practices, multiple councils, multiple police forces that you all have to agree. And that actually gets to your point about whether this is a technical issue or a bureaucratic issue. It is categorically a bureaucratic issue. It is about getting all of those different people to all agree to share data in this way, this much data in this way with these people in these circumstances. And it operates like a vetocracy. So if one of those organizations was to say no, or any one of them was to say no, or just two of them disagree on what is safe to share, you can't share that data. And that so it moves at the speed of the slowest. Another way to show that it's bureaucratic and not technical is if you look at what happened during COVID. Matt Hancock got some data for the NHS and he said it took him 3 weeks to get data that he'd been asking for 3 years and the NHS couldn't provide. So the technical work couldn't have been more than 3 weeks of that 3-year cycle. And that's about right. It's sort of 2% technical, 98% bureaucratic.
So I guess a lot of these sort of data problems and all of the bureaucracy, the data, the DPIA agreements, the data protection impact assessment, things like that, all this paperwork that needs to be done and slows things down. Is this like a lot of the things we talk about on our show, in that it was created for sort of a good reason? There's a lot of sensible rationale behind it, but you sort of add it all together and you just get this sort of snowballing effect and the gears start grinding and slowing things down.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is exactly that. It is exactly the same class of problem. It's like Old Bridge Way, right? Your
Mm.
favorite road. Is there anything that makes that illegal? No, like that is a legal thing to do. We can build roads in this country. But what's happening in that situation is that regulation is interacting with another regulation, which is interacting with ownership, which is interacting with budgeting cycles, which is interacting with processes and procedures and statutory consultees and all that good stuff. And it just becomes impossible.
Mm.
It's one of the reasons why, as a topic, it confuses so many people. Because I've talked to directors in government about this and MPs, and they go, it's confusing. I'm hearing on one hand, this thing is impossible. And on the other hand, it is completely legal and we've got the laws that we need. And the
Mm.
answer is it's both. It is absolutely legal in a lot of the situations, and it's all but impossible with everything once it's all been piled up on top. As a country, I think we know how to deal with things that are illegal. We change the law. We know how to deal with things that are legal and we want to do more of, which is we fund them more. What we don't really have a good playbook for is how to deal with problems that are, on one hand, legal, but on the other hand, there's so much regulation, sludge, whatever it is, that makes it impossible.
And this, I guess, brings me to the Data Alliance, the body that you've created. And this is actually, was this an acronym or a backronym? Because what does Data Alliance stand for?
The Don't Ask Twice Action Alliance. And yes, I think it is a backronym. We started with what we wanted to. At first, we were the Don't Ask Twice Alliance, but then we kept calling ourselves the Don't Ask Twice Alliance, which just offended the sensibilities. So we added the word action in.
Fantastic. And what is Don't Ask Twice? Why is this one of sort of the big ideas behind what you're pushing for?
It's a really good question. And it's because one of the big successes in early days GDS was the tell us once idea that, when someone is deceased, we shouldn't have to go through and tell multiple government organizations that. It's successfully delivered. They'll tell you there's still gaps, but, as is the way with government. But at least it showed, the direction that we want to head. And so for us, that was the vision that we wanted to capture, that idea of government kind of just working, they have the information, you've told them once and they just use it. It's also quite interesting because there are countries and I fear that you're going to ask me which ones, because I'm going to guess that it's Belgium and Singapore, but I don't hold me to that have implemented tell us once laws that say the government must, in preference to asking the same question again, use the data it already holds to answer that question, which are collectively called tell us once laws.
So I guess a really good example of this would be if I move house and change my address, I currently need to, tell probably HMRC, I need to tell the driving license agency, the DVLA. If I was receiving benefits, I'd need to tell DWP and everything else like that. And there'd just be a whole load of paperwork and faffing around, and I'd probably forget one and wonder why something's been forgotten and there's envelopes piling up at my old house. And the idea is that the different governments should be able to share this data and talk to each other.
Yeah, absolutely right. That is the vision. And it's even worse than that. Like, we've just moved house. I don't mind telling you, it's in Lambeth. We moved from Southwark Council to Lambeth Council. And I am having to get a parking permit. I'm having to upload onto Lambeth Council's parking website the council tax notification from our registration from Lambeth Council. These are trivial examples, and it kind of underplays the peril of this, which is, you and I kind of don't need to rely on that many government services. It doesn't impact us in the same way. Say that you were on benefits, or you had a child who had special educational needs, or heaven forfend that you've got intimate partner violence risks, or other elements of your safety were at risk. Ideally, the continuity of that would follow you along. The government has that record of interactions with you, knows your needs, knows your treatment or management plan or benefits entitlement or support, and that would follow you. And actually, most of the time it doesn't. It just kind of falls away until you remember that, oh God, I need to tell the council that I've got this disregard and I've got to, re-enroll at my school for the free school meals, and I've got to make sure that the local police command is aware of some of the risks I'm under and some of the protection they need. And that shouldn't be the way. And that is where people fall into traps. It's where people fall between the cracks, or almost literally.
So that's the problem. So what's the solution to this? You've published a bunch of recommendations about how we can do things better. So tell me, how can we solve this problem and make the government, I don't know, talk to other bits of government better?
We started off the Data Alliance really with an observation that there were some people talking about how bad the problem was, but people hadn't put together a simple concrete plan. And I'd been delivery advisor for the Deputy Prime Minister, and one of the things that I realized is that when you're operating at that level, you need something that you can just go tick. I want one of that. I like that plan. I want that. And that's what we've tried to create with the Data Alliance. And, we've got a 10-point planner, manifesto, what have you. But like at a high level, there's sort of three things that we're trying to fix and three things we're trying to move away from. We're trying to move away from a situation where every new data share is treated like a snowflake, like cutting a new small path through the bush, and instead move to shared data infrastructures. So big highways that share your data. And I say infrastructures because the idea is not that we have one single big government database sat over the top of everybody, but that if you're in London, your healthcare organizations in London can work together to share your data. The second element is that, at the moment, the system's wildly conservative. It's far safer for people to say no than it is to do anything. There's no consideration, no balance of the costs of the risks of sharing with the costs of withholding. And what we want to do is move the presumption towards sharing. We've got an idea in this called duty to share, which says that if it is legal, you've got a duty to share. Because what happens is people think about a decision. What do I have to justify? What do I have to put my name to a decision and take the risk of that decision? And at the moment, that decision is, do I want to share data in this situation? And they face career risks. You, in fact, face 2 years in prison, potentially, if you do this wrong. And yet there's no cost to the fact that you might, entirely stuff up, diabetes care in London, or vaccinations across the country, or what have you, by withholding the data. And what we want to do is say, actually, withholding the data is the thing that you need to justify. If you go and you think about it and go, yeah, the risks in this situation are great enough that we believe that they outweigh the benefits, that should be stopped. But that is the decision within these clusters that should be justified. And someone needs to put their name to owning that decision.
So this is actually quite a radical proposal, I guess, because, we've spent the last however many years as digital tools have become part of everyday life, we've established this entire infrastructure from like the ICO, the Information Commissioner downwards, of be completely paranoid about what data is being shared. Nobody wants to be the USB stick with the database on it left on a train or something like that. And now you're saying, no, we shouldn't be ultra protective. We shouldn't have everything locked as tightly as possible. We should be more willing to share things, and we should shift things more in that direction.
And it's a really good segue to sort of the third principle, which is lower compliance costs safely. Embedded in your question is this presumption that if we make sharing safely easier, it is less safe. And actually, I think, what we've learned through time is if you make the right thing to do hard, people find workarounds. I mean, what happens is you get situations like Afghanistan where, there was no good way for that person to share the information. So they are emailing Excels with hidden tabs that contain information you did not want out there. And that's what happens if you make the right thing difficult to do. So my contention would be, if you go back to the roads through the forest analogy, it is far more dangerous to drive down a country road than it is to drive down a highway. And why is that? It's because the highway is built to a high specification. There are the crash barriers either side. There are police that are patrolling that area, and it's well marked and well lit and well signposted. It's like that for data sharing. We create this profusion of ornate and bespoke data shares, which are an absolute maintenance nightmare for people to understand, catalog, and control, instead of having some shared data infrastructures with known secure implementation and protocols that are robustly tested and well maintained. And so that is a world we want. As a group of people, we've come from, working in areas with classified information. We come from working with healthcare data. We are absolutely not advocating for a wild west of data sharing, but we are saying, A, it is safer to do this stuff through shared infrastructure properly. And then B, yes, there is an element of saying, I had the conversation with someone, and they were going, oh, if you share this data, we talk about, I think, data for free school meals. Oh, someone might get doxxed. You might get a breach and they might get doxxed. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but like, we've got 200,000 children going to school hungry every day, not getting the full benefits of education, harming their life chances. That is an active harm that is happening now. And we've balanced that against this theoretical risk that someone might get doxxed if it's not as secure as it needs to be. And that for me isn't talking about going like, let's go to Wild West. It's just saying, let us make sure that we have understood the benefits and weighed them against the harms instead of looking only at the risks and sort of ignoring the benefit.
I'm going to ask you a Jeremy Paxman question here now, because I buy that as an argument. I find that very persuasive. But I guess in a sense, you are still, if you look at the sort of the trade-offs involved in a lot of data stuff, I imagine it a bit like a slider in that on the one hand, you've got ultra secure and lockdown. And on the other side, you've got, capability or what the government can do. And what you are essentially advocating is we move the slider a few more notches towards letting more stuff happen. And there is an inherent trade-off there, though we can try and make it safe. I guess we can't get past do you reject this trade-off completely, or do you think there is a trade-off there and you're just saying we should take the other side of it?
James, you promised me you weren't going to ask the tough questions, and now you've sprung this on me. It's a really good challenge, and one that I would make in your place too. And I think there's sort of two parts to that answer. The first is there is an awful lot we could do that increases risk negligibly. And the second is there is probably going to be a little bit of like extra risk that you do want to take because the benefits far outweigh it. Like if we take, housing, or if we take roads, or if we take wind turbines and go, well, we want to have more of these. Are we never going to make a wrong decision? Okay, at some point we might, have a harm. We might have lost a landscape or harmed a landscape that we might have ideally have liked to protect. But what's the alternative? It's not, again, we come back to the whole issue with the green lobby and environmentalism, which is we've stopped electrification and moving to renewable energy, which will solve a much bigger problem than, we were trying to protect with the data protection. I think, if I sort of extend your argument one step further, a lot of people get really quite concerned about authoritarian governments coming in and going, oh, what do they do if they have this data? And I sort of say two things to that. Firstly, do you think that's going to stop them? I mean, we're not talking about the data the security services have. I don't know what that is, but I guess it's, a lot more than DFE talking to DWP about your kids' send requirements. And the second is, the reason why people are sort of asking, like, why looking for change, is that they're going, well, the current system isn't giving us public services that we're proud of and that we can rely on. And that's what we're trying to build. And actually, I think it's the classic case of penny wise, pound foolish. You're trying to guard against very small risks. Well, there's quite a significant concern that we lose trust and faith in public services and democracy. And so I think for me, that is the greater benefit that we need to keep our eye on here.
I knew you were going to outfox me with the planning metaphor there to try and win me over. That absolutely works. So you're now coming out with this. You've published your recommendations and your research on your website, which we'll put a link to on abundancepod.com. But I want to ask you very finally, so this is coming at a time when we know that behind the scenes, the government, particularly DSITS, the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, they've got two sort of major programs going on, which is in this sort of area. There's the digital ID system, which has been very controversial so far. And that's essentially a move to sort of do this sort of joining up behind the scenes and help facilitate that sort of joining up. And then also there's the very mysterious National Data Library, which we actually talked about on the show a few months ago with Tom Forth a little bit. This is a thing I've written about because I'm sort of curious. It's this catchphrase that the government have used a lot, even though nobody seems to know quite what it is. So are you hoping that your ideas will influence whatever, the National Data Library and the digital ID system turn out to be?
I would love it if that was the case. You're absolutely right. It's catchphrase. My favorite phrase is a floating signifier, something that we can read into it what we want. And I think the government is going through a process and hopefully will come through a process where they clearly define what they're trying to achieve with the National Data Library. And I would absolutely advocate for this to be a core part of it. We don't need data discovery. There's a solved problem 15 years ago, a company called Google, don't know if you heard about it. We know how to find resources if they're online. What we don't have is the processes and a single body in government that's really running with the question of how do we get this stuff used in anger properly, safely, securely, and for citizens' benefits. And so absolutely, it would be a fantastic thing for the NDL to do. It is also, going to be a big question for the Brit card, for the digital ID. One of the reasons why I think they've had trouble landing it is people always ask, so what? When you talk about data sharing, we talk about a lot of things. How you ask the question matters. And if you ask people like, hey, would it be really handy if you didn't have to carry around a paper or a plastic driver's license? People go, yeah, I'm really up for that. It's like, would it be really great if you could show your ID at Tesco and not have to wait, when you're buying wine, and not have to wait for the guy to come over and look you up and down? And, if there's a safe and secure way to do that, people will be like, yeah, I'm up for that. And I think people are going to be asking for these more and more use cases of BritCard. Okay, we're raising the expectation of how joined up government's going to work. And what they're going to find if they don't really grapple with this question is that they can't build those use cases fast enough. They're going to spend years trying to get all the necessary approvals through. I was talking to a Labour staffer, and his comment was one of the biggest challenges that the centre faces is the speed of getting anything done. And it's not very sexy working on the gubbins of data sharing, no more than it is planning or procurement or any of the fun stuff that you talk about on this podcast.
But it's a very exciting show.
I love it. Long time listener, first time on it. I think it's great. Yeah, but it's not the most sexy stuff, but it needs to be done. Otherwise, the government's going to find that it wants to announce great things. Technically, they could do the work, but they won't be able to get it done because of problems with data sharing and, with the other things we've mentioned.
Cool. And very finally, so the Data Alliance is, you've now published this research. You're out there talking about it. What's next? How can anyone listening who feels fired up and wants to sort of help bang the drum, what can they do to help your cause?
What can they do to help? A few things would be really brilliant. The first is case studies. If you can email us in with examples that you're experiencing of this going wrong, that I can talk policy and procedures all day long. Without those real human examples, this thing, won't get the traction it needs. The second thing is we need allies. So if you are in a position of influence, if you are in government and want to have conversations, we want to have those conversations too. If you can sponsor us in, if you work anywhere that you can, lend your name or your company's or organization's name to what we're doing, the more voices calling for this, the more seriously it's going to be taken. And the third is engage with us. Read our stuff, tell us why it will work, tell us why it won't work. We're not perfect and not everything's going to go forward. But it's only if we have these conversations, these real conversations about, if we want to move the dial, this is what we've got to change, that we're going to see any change at all.
Fantastic. We'll put links on abundancepod.com. But for now, Fabian Chessell, thank you very much.